one of the kind of interesting things about Warren that I used to tell my friends or people who I had conversations with was that he was a real Renaissance man in that he was not only an artist, which apparently most people here in Little Falls recognize him as, but he also designed dresses and actually sewed dresses. He was also a floral designer, and he worked on weddings and that kind of thing. He also had an internship at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and he had a beautiful baritone voice. He was also a gourmet cook, and he had a restaurant and did catering and those kinds of things. So in terms of being artistic and having all kinds of different skills, he was pretty remarkable in that respect. I remember there was one kind of obscure story, maybe. Warren had a piece of property in Annandale on a lake called School Section Lake, which was, like a postage stamp. But he had built a porch-like thing made out of screen, and he would take me up there, and we would hang around for a couple of days and kind of build things and fool around more than anything else. But that was something that I don't know that many other people had that experience with him, but as his nephew, he took me up there several times, and that was kind of interesting. As regards the fabrics and the designing and all that kind of stuff, there was a woman, her name was Bibi Shop, and she was Miss America in like 1950. And she was a friend of Warren's, and she actually asked him to do a wardrobe for her after she was made Miss America. So that was kind of the whole background about the sewing and the designing and stuff. As regards, his general, I think Warren was enthusiastic about all kinds of things in life, and he was most particularly enthusiastic about beauty that he saw in nature. He was terribly enthusiastic about that, and so most of his work is still life, and he did some portraiture and some contemporary things, but most of it had to do with beauty that he saw in nature, and that was the thing that I think that motivated him the most.
And I moved here about 1972, which I guess is a year or so after Warren came to town, and I had a little shopping publication. Some people may remember, it was called the Heartland Peach. The peach business was because it was on peach-colored paper until they quit making it about a year after I started. And it got a little bit questionable why it was called the peach. But anyway, in that I did not do any really newspaper work, just advertising. But occasionally I would do a little bit of a column of editorial kind of thing that made people mad, and some people liked it, and Warren he always stopped into my shop. I don't know how he happened by one day, but he would stop in pretty regularly, and I think that was the main reason to begin with. Something he read in there, or maybe just wondered about how anybody could be so whatever it was. But anyway, we got to be pretty good friends, and we saw each other fairly often over the years, and then got acquainted with my kids, some of them, and they, because they were interested in art and music, and I did hear his recital that he had here in town. I don't remember even where it was, maybe at the school auditorium, I'm not sure. But I hadn't known he was a singer even before that. But he told me some of his past, but he was an interesting guy.
I first moved to Little Falls in 1998, and I am married to Charles Kapsner, who's a painter in his own right. And Charles really knew Warren for a lot longer than I did, and I didn't really understand or know Warren's history or anything. But I did know that Warren lived in one of the most beautiful houses in Little Falls that I had ever seen. And I knew that he was a really beautiful gardener. And so there was a show of Warren's. It was when Laura Hansen owned Bookin' It. It was right across the street from the Great River Arts. And Charles said, we have to just go see this show of his. And it was just a show of all of Warren's paintings. And I saw this painting here, and it was called Bishop's Path. And there were two paintings I was really considering. And this one and one of Warren's that was beautiful spruce trees in wintertime. And I ended up looking at this one saying, this is the one that I want to buy. And I didn't know Warren that well, but I knew this painting. But the part of Warren I did know was when I first moved to town, I lived in an apartment right downtown. And I would meet Warren at the laundromat. And Warren would come up to me and say, I know you. And I'd say, I know you too. And he'd say, do you know that when you take sheets out of the washing machine, you should shake them out before you put them in the dryer? And I said, okay. Because I am married to Charles Kapsner. And Charles and his first wife, Janine, who's a very good friend of both of ours, when they first got married, and this was 1973, so this was, as they say in Italian, tanti anni fa, which is many years ago, Warren went on their honeymoon with them, which a lot of people would say, that seems a little strange. But they were three creative spirits who ended up just following their hearts to the North Shore. And while Janine didn't stay with Charles forever, I ended up with him, and Charles and Warren's friendship was so special that there seems a continuity over the years and the decades that's incredibly special. And while it seems weird to go on a honeymoon, it doesn't seem weird to me. I wrote a story about Warren when he died, which was 10 years ago. And I thought about what I got to know about Warren was he wasn't just a painter, he was a gardener, and he was a singer, and he was a chef, and he had these magnificent gifts in a town where those gifts might have been misinterpreted or misunderstood, or at their very worst, ignored. And I think when I saw this painting, despite the fact that I said the first painting I wanted was one of winter and spruce trees, his gardening and his flowers and the depth of his understanding of his connection to earth and the flowers that came. When I see this painting and I see the purple and the flowers, I think the story I knew of Warren was of gardening and of a connectedness and a joy and a beauty of living every day within the creativity of his life.
Warren, when we met, was like we all already knew each other. It was kind of like a Russian novel. And Terry, I think, knew Warren from work at the courthouse. And Warren had conducted senior citizen tours to Europe. And so that's where Terry had met. And then I met him in the drugstore downtown. And he was ahead of me in line, and he turned around and said, "Oh, hi." Yes, he did. And then from that on, I think I gave him a ride home or something. And that was, I did a lot of things for him and kind of with him for a lot of years. So it was a two-way street, as we were talking about, and he depended on people to help him, but if you did help him, he was a very generous person and cooked food and showed you how to cook and delicious meals. I used to start his car, his Volkswagen. He would always flood his Volkswagen in the winter, and then I would have to come over and salvage it and get it started. He always, his Volkswagen was rabbit. It was a white rabbit, and was always filthy dirty inside. And it was because he hauled gravel and manure and for his garden. All his gardens, everything in the garden was bigger than anybody else's. When you look at a tulip, it was a huge tulip. Peonies were humongous. on the different flowers. I could go right down the line. He planted apple trees one year and surrounded them with manure, and the branches sagged to the ground. It was just like that. He could grow anything. And the goldfish, somebody else was talking about the goldfish.
In his pond.
In the wintertime, they were in a 5-gallon bucket in his kitchen. And the goldfish themselves were
They were huge.
they were as long as the bucket. And so, yeah, Warren was priceless, to say the least. Warren, from the beginning, was after me to make frames for him. He knew that I did woodwork. And he wanted to go and pick out a bunch of little things at the lumber yard, little design things, moldings, even thread spools and knobs and things, and make frames that were character. And so we got, eventually, after a couple of years, we got on this framing project. And I made probably 6, 8, 10 frames for him.
It's at least.
And some of them, this frame and that frame on the Schwann picture, I made 2 of them, one for him and one for us. Anyway, so this ship picture appeared one day on his wall at his house.
Wasn't it a card or something?
Well, I don't know, he'd painted it, and it was around for quite a while.
It was from a card that he had seen.
Yeah, it was from another picture that he had seen. And anyway, long and short of it is one day I was pointing out that I didn't understand some of the yard arms. And I was wondering how accurate it was. And he said, well, it's your picture anyway. And
that was it.
And that was it, and I took it home. And then I made him a frame like this and a frame for this one, and I like this colonial style, but believe me, he didn't like the frame I made for him because it was a colonial style.
Warren came walking into my bookstore when I opened my bookstore here in Little Falls, and he was just so gregarious and open, and he started telling us stories about his life almost immediately. And he was coming in, and he'd been coming in for a long time and chatting with us. And when he came, we had this little store rabbit, little Netherland dwarf rabbit, and he would bring parsley from his garden. So here he comes. It's probably 6 months later, and I had not yet learned his name. And it was getting to the point where it was too late to ask his name. And finally, one day, I just said to him, Warren, I said to him, I have to know your name. I'm so embarrassed. I can't keep calling you the Parsley Man. And he just laughed and laughed and laughed. He thought that was the greatest thing. So in my back of my head, Warren is always the Parsley Man, because that's what he did for our bunnies. But he was wonderful. You know, he just was so full of stories. He'd come in and play Scrabble with us on Scrabble nights. We loved his art. And he brought flowers in from his own garden. He was just such a marvelous gardener. He'd bring them into the store when we had author events, just to help us perk the place up. And they were always, never small, they were always extravagant, large, wonderful in his own vases. And one day I went over to visit Warren, and he had a gate that came around the side of his house into his garden, and you couldn't really see over it. It was very tall, at least I couldn't. And I heard him a lot of vocalization from him in the back. And I knocked a couple of times, and he finally just said, come in, help me. And I thought, oh gosh, I thought something horrible had happened. So I went in the garden, and I come around, and he is flitting around, and Warren, being very large and with his crest of white hair, and his big hair and arms were flapping, and I couldn't understand what he was doing. Well, he had a small built-in pond in the backyard, in his garden, and it was full of goldfish. And there had been a deluge, a huge rain overnight, and his goldfish had, with the water, swum out, and they were all in the yard. So so I spent a few minutes with him gathering up fish, and we'd plop it into garden pots and whatever we could find, and finally had to get a little bit of the water out of the pond so we could put them back in and save his dear fish. So that was just my little bit of Warren. But the image of him in that voluptuous, gorgeous garden with the orange goldfish swimming about in the wet green grass is just an awesome moment. That's my Warren moment. You know, from what I know of him, I know some things that were sketched and painted, and other things are from things he saw through photographs or paintings. He did both, but what you can really tell in all of them when you look at him is like his love of travel, his love of Europe, and his love of the landscape and of gardens, and there's so much color and flowers in it, and so yeah, you really see his love of just the natural world. And
Warren kind of fell into all our lives. My parents first met him when I was quite young. Warren became a grandfather to me, whether he liked it or not. Kind of just adopted him. He was really influential in my life for a lot of things. He was the true Renaissance man that just kind of seeped in, and he was able to sing really loudly while cooking amazing chocolate cake and having this gorgeous garden that we could just run around and play in as 10-year-olds. And he really opened my eyes a lot to, this is when I was really quite young, so he opened my eyes to a whole new world of different things and his art and his eclectic nature. Warren needed to drive me into town for something. I live a little bit outside of town, and I was probably 13 or 14. And so Warren came to pick me up, and he was driving me into town. And I think that the speed limits didn't mean anything to him, but let's just say I have never, still to this day, been more terrified in the passenger seat of a vehicle. But it was great because he just kind of was free and was doing his thing, and he got me to where I needed to be. I think we were running a little bit late, which was the reason behind it. And so he just kind of made sure I was there on time. And I think he knew afterwards that I was a little scared, but he got out of the car afterwards, he gave me a big old hug, and I think I was going to a sports practice, and just said, have a great time, and I'll be here to pick you up. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little nervous to get back in the car to go home with him. But yeah, that's one of my favorites. I just kind of think about, can I say another one that I just thought of? Okay. This kind of has a two-part story. Warren was having a show at the Bookinet one time, and I was kind of assigned to help out with writing on the backs of all the paintings, the names of the paintings. And I think there are actually a couple here that I've seen my 10-year-old, 12-year-old handwriting on the back of. And there was one in particular that I absolutely loved. It's the inside of a purple iris. And I just loved it, and I just remember putting it there, and I'd always asked him about this painting, and he never really said anything about it over the years. And then actually, just before he passed away about this time of the year, and for that Christmas, right before he passed away, he gave me that purple painting for Christmas. And so it hangs in my house. It's right at my stairwell, and it's something I get to see every day. And it just meant so much to me that it was something that I had touched and I had loved so long ago, and he remembered it, and he was able to give it to me. And he gave it to me. It wasn't something that I was able to take retrospectively. So that's a very touching moment for me. I got really lucky after he passed away. I just had always loved the drawings and the stories he would tell about the different people that he did designs for. I mean, he did the wedding dress of a former, I think, Miss America, and he would just always have these great ideas for these beautiful costumes. And so one of the first things I asked about was where was the portfolio of all of his drawings and dress designs and his hat designs. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to get that, which is this book here. And he just had so many different mediums, different styles, different even types of paper. I mean, there's the ones that are up right now are watercolor, and he also has some that are charcoal based, and some that are some sort of pencil, and some that are on like the back of a restaurant menu. They're just really great things, and he just had these like beautiful ideas, whether they actually came to fruition or not. He was able to really just think very creatively. So that's what I get to have as a lot of his dress designs and his hat designs.
Warren was, to me, I first met him because of his voice. and I was singing at the St. Mary's Cathedral Choir, and one of the sopranos came up to Little Falls for voice lessons, and she said, "You should come along." And so I did a couple of times, and I couldn't afford the lessons, but I really remember them as being a unique experience. I'll never forget, those of you who sing voice will understand this. He would go up and down the scales on the piano and singing the note, and I would follow him. I distinctly remember G sharp, where my whole torso resonated. And he said, when you sing correctly, all the notes will feel like that when you sing them. So, being a great voice, he knew that. And I've never been able to do better than G sharp. So I needed more practice. Anyway, the other memory I have is Charles Kapsner and I met Warren for lunch over at the Pine Edge, and nice restaurant there, and a lot of windows and nice and light. And the table next to us, someone was having a birthday party, birthday lunch, and I'm not sure if they started singing Happy Birthday, but Warren just jumped right in and he did an operatic version of Happy Birthday, and it was very nice. That's a nice memory about Warren. I just wish, getting back to the voice thing, I just wish he would have, I could have heard him more in that sort of situation, but I do remember one other thing. Our choir director in St. Mary's in St. Cloud would invite Warren to come down to do solos with our pieces, and he would send him the music and everything, but he just never did, and I don't know why, but I just wish he could have come and sang for us once.
Well, I first met Warren in the mid-1990s. He became a patient of mine when he was riding his bike through town and got hit by a car. And he was okay, but we got to be very, very close friends for, until 15 or 20 years until he died. He died about a month ago, in January of 2005. So we all miss him very much. Warren was a very interesting man. He was a gourmet chef. He was a hat designer, a wedding and a dress designer. Was just a Renaissance man. Besides being a painter, he would make Venetian torts for people who had parties. One of my funniest stories is one time he borrowed one of our cars, and it was a Volkswagen Beetle with a stick shift, and he didn't know how to drive a stick shift, but we got him through that part. But unfortunately, he never knew where reverse was. So he went over to Walmart one day and parked and could not figure out how to get the car to the parking lot, so he ended up getting out and pushing the car backwards in neutral at age 80. And then the next day he goes back and he parks way out in the hinterlands, as far away from the stores you can get. Comes back out, someone pulled right in front of him. So he couldn't get out again. That would be a typical Warren story. He was an impressionist painter, and believe me, I'm no expert. A lot of stuff he did from pictures or photographs that he had, and he spent quite a bit of time in Europe. He traveled all through Europe. He was a tour guide, actually, for tours out of Little Falls to Europe. So he was probably my age at the time, and then would take, quote, the elderly to Europe. So a lot of his inspiration also came from when he was in Austria and Germany on these tours. We have a few pictures here that are ours also. There's 3 pictures in particular that are of Keukenhof Gardens in Amsterdam, all tulip pictures, which are just stunning. And then his signature piece is over here around the corner, is a canal system in Amsterdam with a little boat in it. And that's what I think he was most proud of.
So I was up north for about 2 weeks as we had this big construction project going on, so I was working with Tri-State and the crushing crew, so we had to work this on the weekends. So I come back down because on the weekends I would still work and study with Warren when I was down here in the summer. So he had started this thing like, oh my God, this thing is like so hugely electric. I mean, Warren, where are you going with it? And that was it was a big departure for him, this particular piece right here. And obviously, he spent a lot of time on it. You can tell by looking at it, you know. And the fact that it never sold, I was quite puzzled by, but by the fact that I was able to finally get it. This one going back behind us, this was the very first painting that I had ever bought from Warren. It was done like in 1972, so it must have been in 73, early 74. I bought it for the big price of $150, which back in those days was a substantial amount of money. So that was one. It's a little house in Monticello, and of course I was studying with Warren at that time. And I guess the most important thing about meeting Warren was he's someone who had such an incredible variety of talents. I was looking for a better word, but I mean, he was not only a painter, he was an opera singer, he was like a chef, he was a gardener, he was a fashion designer. I mean, Warren just lived and breathed creativity in such a way that he brought it to a level that you could understand it in such beautiful ways. And so when I met him in the fall of 1972, I had just began studying at St. Cloud State for a second time and was really not happy with the class structure. And Warren had just moved to Little Falls and started doing these evening classes on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. So I began coming up here to study with him. And the very first night, his opening lecture, what he expected of us, what he was going to do, what he was going to teach, I realized this is the guy I need to be talking to. And of course, I was, in those days, probably 20, so it came up, and it was a 12-week class, Tuesdays and Thursdays, quick break for the holidays, again then in winter of '73, again 12 weeks, and then he just said, well, do you want to come and study? And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, because I mean, I'm learning more from you than anywhere else. But in the midst of all this, he suggested that I go to school in Europe to really pursue, drawing the way I wanted to, because I was very much into classical realism. You can see clearly we have in front of us is Impressionism. I did paint that way and clearly have great admiration for Impressionism and all that. But Warren saw where I needed to go, exactly, and said, go to Europe. So I wrote to the Italian Government Information Center in the late '72, early '73, got addresses of the different places, and then left for Italy in September of 1973. But if it had not been for, meeting Warren, that part of my education and my life would never changed and wouldn't be where it's at today, because he knew that I wasn't happy here. I think this is a very fine collection of what Warren did. There's a huge diversity of his interests, subject matter. You can see the stylistic changes, the very focused piece, the very front one from the late '60s. Color's much more naturalistic, and this yet in the early '70s, and even this kind of departure. But if you look at the paintings, you can see how he moved, and so I tried to, in hanging all these, go decade by decade, because by the time you get to the far end, you can see that colors and technique have changed. But Warren was very prolific. I mean, he did like hundreds of paintings, probably in the thousands. But his sketches, I mean, everyone's got like tons of sketches, whether it be like his fashion pieces. He designed hats, he designed dresses, costumes, whatnot. He did opera costumes. He did BB Shop, who was like Miss Minnesota 1948. I think she was Miss America. He did her wedding dress, and there was something like 3,000 pearls in her wedding. It was phenomenal. I mean, you need to find those old photos of that dress, which I think Dr. Pisapia might have. But I mean, the fact that everything he did breathed art. I mean, Warren was creative from the time he got up in the morning to the time he went to bed at night, and God only knows what he was dreaming about. But Warren that's all he did in all realms, which is really phenomenal.
Warren Woodworth Retrospective. I remember the day I arrived at your place, that double stack of crumbling red brick, and entered the garden through the side gate to find you dancing in the grass like a white-haired god. It had rained that night, heavily, and the water had overrun the pond, and with the water, the goldfish too. They were swimming frantically in the lawn. The sun beamed down on the wet mat of grass, ignited the backs and flailing tails of the fish like sparks. They curved in their grassy pool like oranges peeled and sectioned. You instructed me to gather them up, and we popped them into garden pots. We cupped them in our hands like manna and poured them into a dented silver pail. We laughed and clapped our hands when all was finished, but really, I could see the panic in your face. These were your protected ones. It was your job to keep them safe. The whole affair was like a Matisse painting, goldfish in a summer garden, and you, the painter, moved like a great flapping crane through the whole of your creation, directing, protecting, preening.